Most people misunderstand what it means to hurt an empath. They assume that because empaths are kind, patient, and forgiving, they are somehow less affected by emotional wounds than everyone else. In reality, the opposite is often true. The very qualities that make an empath compassionate also make them uniquely vulnerable to emotional pain. And that pain doesn't disappear when the conversation ends, when the argument is over, or when the person responsible decides to move on. An empath experiences human interaction differently. While many people focus primarily on words and actions, empaths naturally absorb emotional undercurrents. They notice the hesitation in someone's voice, the sadness hidden behind a smile, the frustration concealed beneath politeness. They don't just process information, they process emotional reality. This ability allows them to connect deeply with others, but it also means that negative experiences penetrate much further beneath the surface. When someone hurts an empath, the injury is rarely confined to the moment itself. The empath doesn't simply hear criticism, they analyze the intention behind it. They don't just witness betrayal, they examine the emotional dynamics that created it. Their minds naturally search for understanding, context, and meaning. This is one of their greatest strengths, but under painful circumstances, it can become an exhausting burden. Think about how most people react after a difficult interaction. They may feel angry, disappointed, or frustrated for a period of time, but eventually they shift their attention elsewhere. An empath often follows a different path. They revisit the experience repeatedly, not because they enjoy suffering, but because their minds are attempting to reconcile what happened with what they believed was true. They ask questions that many others never consider. Did I miss something? Could I have handled that differently? What pain was that person carrying? Why would someone I cared about choose to act this way? Notice that these questions are rarely centered on blame. Empaths tend to seek understanding before judgment. They instinctively try to see the situation from multiple perspectives. This can make them incredibly wise and emotionally intelligent. It can also make them vulnerable to remaining in harmful situations far longer than they have. It's SILD. One of the most fascinating psychological realities about empaths is that they often carry emotional responsibility that doesn't belong to them. When relationships become unhealthy, they frequently assume that if they can just understand enough, support enough, love enough, or communicate enough, the problem can be fixed. This belief comes from a noble place. Empaths genuinely want healing. They genuinely want connection. They genuinely want people to become the best version of themselves. But this desire can create a dangerous illusion. It can convince them that every relationship is salvageable, and every wound can be repaired through enough patience and compassion. Unfortunately, reality doesn't always cooperate with good intentions. There comes a point where understanding someone no longer protects you from the consequences of their behavior. You may understand why someone lies. You may understand why someone becomes manipulative. You may understand why someone repeatedly breaks trust. But understanding a behavior is not the same thing as excusing it. This distinction is where many empaths struggle because they are capable of seeing the wounded parts of people. They sometimes ignore the damage those wounded parts are causing. They focus on potential instead of patterns. They focus on explanations instead of outcomes. As a result, emotional pain accumulates quietly. And that's the key word, quietly. The world often assumes that emotional damage announces itself dramatically. People expect explosive arguments, emotional confrontations, or obvious signs of distress. Yet some of the deepest wounds develop in silence. An empath may continue showing up. They may continue supporting others. They may continue smiling. They may continue giving second, third, fourth, and fifth chances. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, every disappointment leaves a mark. Every broken promise leaves a mark. Every dismissal of their feelings leaves a mark. Every act of disrespect leaves a mark. Because empaths tend to focus on harmony, they often don't reveal the full extent of what they're carrying. Others see their patience and mistakenly assume there are no consequences. They interpret forgiveness as weakness. They interpret understanding as unlimited tolerance. Nothing could be further from the truth. What appears to be endless patience is often an enormous emotional burden being managed internally. The empath isn't unaffected. They're simply processing the pain differently. They're trying to make sense of it before reacting to it. But human beings have limits. Even the most compassionate person has limits. Even the most understanding person has limits. Even the person who sees the good in everyone has limits. Eventually, accumulated pain begins to change the way the empath views the relationship. The questions slowly shift. Instead of asking, "How can I help this person?" they begin asking, "Why am I sacrificing myself to save something that refuses to improve?" That shift is profound, because once an empath reaches that point, they are no longer evaluating the other person's intentions. They are evaluating the reality of the situation. They begin measuring actions instead of promises, patterns instead of potential, truth instead of hope. And when that realization arrives, it often surprises everyone involved. The people around them think the empath changed overnight. The empath knows it happened one disappointment at a time. What looked like sudden withdrawal was actually the final result of months, or years, of notional accumulation. The greatest mistake anyone can make is assuming that because an empath continues to care, they are not being affected. In many cases, the person who appears strongest is carrying the heaviest emotional load. The person who appears calm is fighting the hardest internal battle, and the person who keeps giving chances is often the one closest to reaching their limit. That's why hurting an empath carries consequences that many people never see until it's for. The damage isn't measured by a single moment. It's measured by everything that quietly accumulates afterward. And here's the truth worth remembering. Every act of kindness should never be mistaken for invulnerability, because the deepest hearts often carry the deepest scars. Now, once we understand that empaths absorb pain more deeply than most people realize, we have to examine something even more significant. The depth of an empath's pain is directly connected to the depth of their love. This is where many people completely misread the situation. Most individuals assume that emotional sensitivity means emotional fragility. They think that because an empath feels deeply, they are somehow weak. But what they fail to recognize is that deep feeling is often a sign of deep investment. Empaths don't simply care more, they commit more. They don't just participate in relationships, they immerse themselves in them. When an empath chooses to love someone, whether it's a friend, family member, partner, or even a colleague they genuinely believe in, they rarely do it halfway. Their investment is total. They pay attention to details others overlook. They remember conversations. They notice emotional shifts. They remember what matters to people. They celebrate victories that aren't their own, and feel concern when others are struggling. In many ways, an empath experiences connection as a responsibility rather than a convenience. This is important to understand because most relationships operate on some form of emotional exchange. People give support and receive support. They give attention and receive attention. There is an ongoing balance. Empaths, however, often approach relationships differently. Their natural instinct is to give first. They focus on what others need long before they consider their own needs. At first, this can seem like an extraordinary gift. People feel seen around them. They feel understood. They feel valued. Many people spend their entire lives searching for someone who truly listens. Then an empath enters their life, and suddenly, they experience a level of understanding they rarely encounter anywhere else. But here's where the danger begins. Because the empath gives so naturally, others can start treating that generosity as normal. What was once appreciated becomes expected. What was once recognized as special becomes invisible. Human beings adapt quickly to positive experiences. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. We become accustomed to blessings. We stop noticing what consistently benefits us. The same thing often happens in relationships with empaths. The person receiving the empath's care gradually stops seeing it as a gift and starts seeing it as a permanent feature of reality. They assume the empath will always be there. They assume the empath will always understand. They assume forgiveness will always be available. And assumptions are often where respect begins to disappear. The paradox is fascinating. The more an empath loves someone, the more opportunities they create for that person to take them for granted. Why? Because empaths are willing to tolerate discomfort in order to preserve connection. Most people will react quickly when boundaries are crossed. Empaths often pause. They seek understanding first. They ask questions. They consider context. They wonder if the other person is struggling. They give room for mistakes. Again, this comes from compassion. But compassion without boundaries can become self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice, repeated over time, creates imbalance. When imbalance becomes the norm, the relationship slowly changes shape. One person continues investing emotional energy, while the other becomes increasingly comfortable receiving it. One person continues extending grace, while the other begins expecting it. This creates a dangerous psychological dynamic. The empath is becoming more emotionally attached because of their investment. The other person is becoming less appreciative because of familiarity. One side is valuing the relationship more deeply. The other side is valuing it less consciously. Then something happens that reveals the true cost of this imbalance: betrayal. Betrayal doesn't always mean infidelity or dramatic deception. Betrayal can take many forms. It can be repeated dishonesty. It can be chronic disrespect. It can be emotional neglect. It can be dismissing someone's feelings repeatedly. It can be choosing convenience over loyalty. Whatever form it takes, the impact on an empath is often far greater than people anticipate. Because when an empath is betrayed, they aren't losing a casual connection. They're losing something they spent enormous emotional energy building. Think about the difference between dropping a pebble and dropping a diamond. The act may look identical from the outside. The loss is not. The deeper the investment, the greater the emotional consequence. This is why betrayal feels so devastating to empaths. They don't simply mourn what happened. They mourn what they believed existed. They mourn the future they imagined. They mourn the trust they carefully constructed over months or years. Trust, after all, is not built in a moment. Trust is accumulated. It's built through consistency. It's built through reliability. It's built through repeated evidence that someone is safe. And because empaths pay such close attention to emotional details, trust becomes one of their most valuable possessions. When they offer it, they are offering something substantial, something earned, something meaningful. That's why many people are shocked when an empath eventually changes. They say things like, "I don't understand. They used to be so loving." What they fail to realize is that the problem was that love was repeatedly met with behavior that contradicted it. No amount of affection can survive indefinitely without respect. No amount of patience can survive indefinitely without accountability. No amount of understanding can survive indefinitely without reciprocity. Eventually, the empath begins to recognize a difficult truth. Love alone does not create a healthy relationship. Many people love deeply. Far fewer know how to protect what they love. And that realization is often one of the most painful lessons an empath will ever learn. Because they genuinely wanted the relationship to work. They genuinely believed in the person. They genuinely saw possibilities others could not see. Yet reality eventually demands evidence. Potential is not evidence. Promises are not evidence. Intentions are not evidence. Behavior is evidence. And when behavior repeatedly contradicts trust, even the deepest love begins to transform. Not into hatred, not into revenge, but into clarity. The empath finally sees the difference between who someone could become and who they consistently choose to be. And that moment changes everything. Because once clarity replaces illusion, the relationship can never return to what it was before. The person who caused the damage often assumes they can repair things later. They assume another apology will solve it. Another explanation will fix it. Another promise will restore what was lost. But they fail to understand that the real damage wasn't caused in a single moment. It was caused by repeatedly mishandling something extraordinarily valuable. The deeper an empath loves you, the more trust they place in your hands. And the tragedy is that many people don't recognize the value of that trust until they've already broken it. Remember this: the greatest losses in life are rarely the things we never had. They are the things we had in abundance, and failed to appreciate until they were gone. Once we understand how deeply empaths love and how much emotional energy they invest in the people they care about, we arrive at one of the most misunderstood aspects of their nature: forgiveness. If you ask most people what makes an empath different, they'll mention compassion, sensitivity, or emotional awareness. All of those qualities are true, but beneath them lies something even more powerful, and sometimes more dangerous. Empaths possess an extraordinary capacity to forgive. At first glance, forgiveness seems like an unquestionable virtue. We admire people who can let go of resentment. We respect those who choose understanding over revenge. Philosophers, spiritual teachers, and psychologists have all emphasized the importance of forgiveness in human relationships. And they're right. Forgiveness can be healing. Forgiveness can free us from bitterness. Forgiveness can allow relationships to recover from mistakes. But forgiveness has a shadow side that few people discuss. When forgiveness is given without accountability, it can become permission. This is where many empaths find themselves trapped, because their natural instinct is to see humanity before behavior. When someone hurts them, their first response is rarely, "How dare they?" Their first response is often, "What happened to them?" That question changes everything. Most people focus on the offense. Empaths focus on the pain behind the offense. They look for context. They search for explanations. They try to understand what emotional wounds, fears, insecurities, or past experiences may have contributed to someone's actions. This ability makes them incredibly compassionate. It also makes them vulnerable to remaining in situations they should have left long ago. Think about how many unhealthy relationships continue not because love exists, but because hope exists. Hope is powerful. Hope convinces people to stay. Hope convinces people to wait. Hope convinces people that tomorrow will be different from today. Empaths are particularly susceptible to hope because they often see possibilities that others overlook. They see the good qualities buried beneath destructive behavior. They see moments of kindness hidden among patterns of disrespect. They see potential, and sometimes potential becomes the very thing that blinds them. One of the greatest psychological mistakes any person can make is confusing potential with reality. Potential is who someone could become. Reality is who they consistently choose to be. Empaths often fall in love with the first and struggle to accept the second. As a result, forgiveness becomes a cycle. A promise is broken. The empath forgives. A boundary is crossed. The empath forgives. Trust is damaged. The empath forgives again. From the outside, this behavior can seem irrational. People watching may wonder why the empath stays, why they keep believing, why they continue offering chances. But from the empath's perspective, every act of forgiveness feels justified. They remember the person's struggles. They remember their vulnerabilities. They remember the moments when they seemed sincere. Most importantly, they remember who they believe that person can become. What many fail to understand is that empaths are not naive. They are not blind. In fact, they often see the problems more clearly than anyone else. The difference is that they believe understanding those problems creates an obligation to help. This belief can be beautiful. It can also become deeply self-destructive, because there comes a point where helping someone is no longer helping them. It is enabling them. There is an old psychological principle worth considering. Behavior that produces no meaningful consequence tends to repeat itself. Human beings learn through outcomes. When actions repeatedly generate the same result, people become conditioned to expect that result again. This applies to every relationship. If someone repeatedly lies and faces no consequences, the behavior often continues. If someone repeatedly disrespects boundaries, and those boundaries remain unenforced, the behavior often continues. If someone repeatedly damages trust and is immediately forgiven without change, the cycle usually repeats. Not because people are inherently malicious, but because human behavior follows patterns, and patterns become habits. This is where the empath begins carrying an invisible burden. Every forgiveness appears generous on the surface, but internally something is accumulating. Disappointment accumulates. Confusion accumulates. Emotional exhaustion accumulates. The empath may still smile. They may still offer support. They may still say the relationship is fine. Yet beneath the surface, an emotional ledger is quietly being written. Every broken promise is recorded. Every dismissal is remembered. Every moment of feeling unseen leaves an impression. This doesn't happen because the empath is keeping score. It happens because the human mind naturally tracks emotional experiences. Trust is built through repetition. So is distrust. And eventually, a subtle shift begins. The empath starts noticing something they were previously unwilling to confront. The apologies are changing nothing. The explanations are changing nothing. The promises are changing nothing. Only the words are changing. The behavior remains the same. That realization is often devastating because it forces the empath to face a painful truth. The person they have been fighting for may not be fighting for the relationship at all. For a long time, the empath believed patience would create transformation. Now they begin questioning whether patience has simply delayed reality. This is the moment where forgiveness starts evolving into something else. Not anger, not hatred, acceptance. Acceptance is one of the most powerful psychological states a person can reach, because acceptance removes illusion. It removes fantasy. It removes the endless negotiation between what is and what we wish existed. The empath begins to understand that compassion cannot substitute for accountability. Love cannot substitute for effort. Understanding cannot substitute for respect. And perhaps most importantly, forgiveness cannot substitute for change. This realization often shocks the people around them. Why? Because the empath spent so much time being patient that everyone assumed patience was permanent. The person receiving endless chances starts believing the chances will never end. The repeated forgiveness creates an illusion of permanence. But every act of forgiveness has a limit. Not because the empath becomes cruel, not because they stop caring, but because reality eventually becomes impossible to ignore. The relationship reaches a point where continuing to forgive would require abandoning self-respect. And empaths may sacrifice many things, but eventually they recognize that sacrificing themselves helps no one. When that moment arrives, the shift can appear sudden. To outsiders, it seems like the empath changed overnight. In truth, the decision was forming for months or years. Every disappointment contributed. Every broken promise contributed. Every ignored boundary contributed. The final departure is simply the visible result of a process that began long before anyone noticed. And here's the lesson that too many people learn too late. Forgiveness is one of the most valuable gifts a human being can offer, but its value disappears when it is treated as an unlimited resource. Because the strongest relationships are not built on endless forgiveness. They are built on mutual respect that makes endless forgiveness unnecessary. And that is something worth remembering. Every time someone forgives you, they're giving you an opportunity, not a guarantee. What you do with that opportunity determines whether trust grows stronger or quietly disappears forever. If there is one moment that people consistently misunderstand when it comes to empaths, it is the moment they finally detach. Most people assume the breaking point arrives with anger. They expect a dramatic confrontation, an emotional outburst, or some obvious display of frustration. They imagine that if an empath has truly had enough, everyone around them will know it immediately. But that's rarely how it happens. In fact, one of the most dangerous assumptions a person can make is believing that an empath's silence means everything is fine. Because the most significant change doesn't occur when the empath becomes emotional. It occurs when they stop trying. That distinction is critical. When someone continues arguing with you, challenging you, explaining themselves, or expressing disappointment, there is still investment. There is still hope. There is still a belief that the relationship can improve. Emotion, even painful emotion, often indicates attachment. Indifference is something entirely different, and what many people fail to recognize is that emotional detachment is rarely an impulsive decision. It is usually the final stage of a long psychological process. By the time an empath reaches detachment, they have often spent months or even years attempting to preserve the relationship. They have communicated their concerns. They have explained their feelings. They have offered understanding. They have forgiven mistakes. They have adjusted expectations. They have searched for solutions. In many cases, they have done everything within their power to create a different outcome. What appears to outsiders as a sudden departure is usually the visible conclusion of an invisible struggle. Psychologists often talk about emotional investment as a form of psychological commitment. The more time, energy, attention, and emotional resources people invest into something, the harder it becomes to walk away from it. This applies to careers. It applies to friendships. It applies to romantic relationships. And it certainly applies to empaths. Because empaths don't merely invest emotionally, they invest deeply. They believe in people. They believe in growth. They believe in transformation. And because of those beliefs, they often stay committed long after others would have left. But eventually, something changes. The empath begins noticing a pattern, not a single mistake, not a temporary setback, a pattern. And patterns have a unique power, because they reveal reality more accurately than isolated events. Anyone can have a bad day. Anyone can make a poor decision. Anyone can fail once. But repeated behavior tells a story. Repeated behavior reveals priorities. Repeated behavior reveals character. And when an empath finally stops focusing on promises and starts focusing on patterns, the relationship enters a new phase. This is often where the internal conflict begins. Part of them still remembers the good moments. Part of them still sees potential. Part of them still wants things to work. But another part is becoming impossible to silence. The part that recognizes reality. The part that understands that hope cannot replace evidence. The part that understands that loyalty should not require self-destruction. This creates a profound psychological tension. Because empaths are not simply deciding whether to leave a relationship. They are deciding whether to let go of a vision. They are letting go of what they hoped the relationship could become. And that is often far more painful than letting go of the relationship itself. Human beings become attached not only to people, but also to possibilities. We grieve futures that never happen. We mourn expectations that never become reality. We struggle to release stories we've been telling ourselves for years. Empaths experience this intensely because they are naturally oriented toward possibility. They see what could be. They imagine what might happen if everyone healed, grew, communicated, and changed. For a long time, that vision keeps them invested. But eventually, reality demands an answer. And reality has a question that potential can never answer. What is actually happening? Not what could happen. Not what should happen. Not what might happen someday. What is happening right now? The moment an empath begins answering that question honestly, detachment starts taking shape. At first, it's subtle. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop chasing conversations. They stop trying to convince someone to care. They stop fighting battles that should never have required a fight in the first place. The change is almost invisible. In fact, the person causing the damage often doesn't notice it. Why? Because they became accustomed to the empath doing all the emotional work. They became accustomed to the empath maintaining the connection. They became accustomed to receiving effort without providing equal effort in return. And when the empath quietly begins withdrawing that energy, the absence isn't immediately obvious. But something important is happening internally. The empath is no longer investing in hope. They are investing in acceptance. Acceptance is often mistaken for weakness. In reality, it is one of the strongest psychological states a person can achieve. Acceptance means seeing reality without distortion, without denial, without fantasy, without excuses. It means acknowledging that some people will not become who we hoped they would become. And it means recognizing that continuing to sacrifice yourself will not create change in someone who has no intention of changing. This realization transforms the empath, not because they become colder, not because they become less compassionate, but because they finally direct some of that compassion toward themselves. For perhaps the first time, they begin asking different questions. Instead of asking, "How can I save this relationship?" they ask, "What is this relationship costing me?" Instead of asking, "How can I help this person?" they ask, "Why am I ignoring my own needs?" Instead of asking, "How much more can I give?" they ask, Why am I giving to someone who refuses to meet me halfway? Those questions are powerful because they shift attention from external responsibility to internal truth. And once that shift occurs, detachment accelerates, the emotional bond weakens, the urgency disappears, the constant need to fix things fades away. The empath stops chasing outcomes. They stop negotiating with reality. They stop carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. Then comes the moment that surprises everyone. The empath leaves. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Not with dramatic declarations. They simply leave. And that's often when the other person suddenly realizes what happened. The conversations have stopped. The emotional availability is gone. The patience that once seemed endless has disappeared. The support they relied on is no longer there. For the first time, they experience the absence of what they spent years taking for granted. But by then, the empath has already completed the hardest part of the process internally. The departure happened long before the physical goodbye. The emotional separation occurred months earlier. What others perceive as a sudden ending was actually the final chapter of a story that had been unfolding quietly for a very long time. And that is why emotional detachment is such a powerful consequence. It is not an act of punishment. It is the moment an empath finally accepts what they can no longer change and chooses peace over endless struggle. Remember this: when an empath stops fighting for the connection, the battle is usually already over, because the most permanent goodbyes are often spoken in silence long before they are spoken out loud. As we reach the final piece of this discussion, we arrive at what may be the most brutal consequence of hurting an empath, not because it is dramatic, and not because it involves revenge, but because of what is permanently lost. When people think about consequences, they often imagine punishment. They imagine anger, conflict, or some visible form of retaliation. But life rarely works that way. The most significant consequences are often invisible. They reveal themselves slowly, over time, through absence rather than action. And when an empath finally walks away, what is lost is not simply a relationship. What is lost is access to someone who genuinely saw the best in you. That may sound simple, but psychologically, it is one of the rarest gifts another human being can offer. Most people interact with others through a lens of evaluation. They notice strengths and weaknesses. They judge performance. They assess value based on results, status, appearance, or behavior. This is normal. Human beings naturally categorize and evaluate the world around them. Empaths do something different. They see beyond what is immediately visible. They look beneath behavior. They search for motivations. They look for hidden potential. They often recognize strengths that even the individual themselves cannot see. This is why people are frequently drawn to empaths. Being understood is one of the deepest psychological desires human beings possess. We all want to believe that someone sees more in us than our mistakes. We want to believe that our flaws do not define us completely. Empaths offer that experience naturally. They look at someone who is struggling and see capability. They look at someone who is insecure and see value. They look at someone who has failed and see possibility. This ability can change lives. History is filled with examples of people who achieved extraordinary things because someone believed in them before they believed in themselves. The right encouragement can transform a person. The right support can rebuild confidence. The right relationship can become the foundation for tremendous growth. Empaths often provide exactly that kind of environment. They become emotional safe places. They become sources of stability. They become people others rely upon during periods of uncertainty and difficulty. But here is the irony. Many people only recognize the value of this support after it disappears. Why? Because human beings tend to focus on what is missing rather than what is present. When support is constant, it becomes background noise. When encouragement is always available, it becomes expected. When loyalty never wavers, it feels permanent. And permanence creates complacency. People stop appreciating what they assume will always remain. This pattern appears in almost every area of life. We take health for granted until illness arrives. We take opportunities for granted until they disappear. We take relationships for granted until distance replaces them. The same thing happens with empaths. Their kindness becomes familiar. Their patience becomes expected. Their understanding becomes routine. Eventually, the extraordinary starts to look ordinary. And that is where the danger begins. Because while others are becoming comfortable, the empath is quietly evaluating reality. Remember everything we've discussed so far. The empath absorbed pain longer than anyone realized. They loved deeply. They forgave repeatedly. They gave chance after chance. And eventually, they detached. Now we arrive at the final consequence. The person who caused the damage suddenly finds themselves without the one individual who consistently saw their highest potential. This realization often arrives too late. At first, they may feel relief. They assume the relationship ending solved the tension. They assume life will continue exactly as before. But over time, something begins to happen. Moments emerge when they instinctively reach for the support that used to exist. They want encouragement. They want understanding. They want someone who genuinely listens. They want someone who believes in them. And then they remember, that person is gone. Not physically gone necessarily, emotionally gone. The connection that once existed has vanished. And perhaps for the first time, they begin seeing the relationship clearly. Distance has a remarkable way of revealing value. When something is close, we focus on its imperfections. When something is gone, we recognize its significance. This is why regret is such a powerful emotion. Regret is not merely sadness. Regret is clarity arriving after opportunity has expired. It is the realization that what we possessed was more valuable than we understood. And when it comes to empaths, that realization can be particularly painful. Because empaths contribute things that are difficult to replace. You can replace convenience. You can replace entertainment. You can replace circumstances. But replacing genuine understanding is much harder. Replacing authentic loyalty is much harder. Replacing someone who consistently believed in your potential is much harder. Those qualities are rare, and rarity is what creates value. Consider for a moment how many relationships are based primarily on conditions. People stay as long as benefits exist. People remain supportive as long as circumstances are favorable. People offer loyalty until challenges emerge. Empaths often operate differently. They support people during difficult seasons. They remain present during struggles. They continue believing in others when evidence is scarce. That kind of commitment leaves a lasting impact. But it also means that losing it creates a lasting void. The tragic part is that many people spend years searching for exactly what they once had. Not necessarily the person themselves, but the experience. The feeling of being understood. The feeling of being accepted. The feeling of knowing someone genuinely wanted the best for them. And they discover that such experiences are not as common as they assumed. This is why the ultimate consequence of hurting an empath is not their anger. It is not their departure. It is not even the ending of the relationship. The ultimate consequence is realizing the true value of what was lost only after it can no longer be recovered. Because by the time an empath reaches the point of complete detachment, they have already gone through the grief, the reflection, the disappointment, and the acceptance. They have already learned the lesson. The person left behind is often just beginning to learn theirs. And that lesson is profound. Never underestimate the value of someone who sees the best in you while also seeing the truth about you. Those people are rare. They are not guaranteed. And when they choose to leave, they often take with them something that cannot easily be replaced. The unwavering belief that you could become more than you currently are. So remember this. The greatest tragedy is not losing someone who cared about you. The greatest tragedy is realizing too late that they cared in ways no one else ever did.